Hello. Today we're discussing the hot topic of race relations and systemic discrimination in Canada. The last several weeks have been a whirlwind of global protest and outcry against police brutality and racism against Blacks, Indigenous, and people of color. The catalyst for this movement was the brutal murder of George Floyd of Minnesota. Floyd, a Black American man, died after a white police officer, Derek Chauvin, kneeled on his neck for roughly 8 minutes during an arrest for allegedly passing a counterfeit $20 bill at a grocery store. After a bystander filmed this crime on her phone, horrified viewers around the world, including me, watched as Floyd's pleas, "I can't breathe," were ignored, and his body eventually went limp. Besides this death, we have heard of the recent deaths of several other racialized individuals in the US and Canada due to police brutality. In Canada, recent victims include a Black Indigenous woman, Regis Paquette, Black Canadian DeAndre Campbell, and Chantel Moore and Rodney Levi, both Indigenous Canadians. Nelson Mandela said, "Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world." Today, we're taking time to better understand some of the racial context in Canada as a necessary step toward effecting positive change. So, to my immediate right is Greg Burkett. He's a history teacher and guidance counselor with the Toronto District School Board, and he has been featured on the CBC for his work as a playwright, spoken word artist, and author, focusing on race relations. Beside him, we have Paul Erskine, who's a criminal defense lawyer who's represented clients charged with various crimes at all levels of court throughout the province of Ontario, including the Ontario Court of Appeal. And finally, we have Campbell Page, who is a Red River Métis and the Indigenous Ministries Director for the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Canada, whose mandate is to help the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Canada and its members understand the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action and how it applies to them, and to nurture reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. We've heard Canadian officials, including Ontario Premier Doug Ford and the RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki, deny that systemic racism exists. So our first course of action will be to dispel this myth and express what systemic racism looks like in different contexts. So we do acknowledge that other minority groups, including East and Southeast Asians, have experienced historic and systemic racism in Canada. However, today we are focusing on Blacks and Indigenous peoples, two groups reporting the highest levels of discrimination as a springboard for understanding racism in Canada across the board. So the first question is, what is systemic racism? So I've heard it described as policies that are put in place by organizations to somehow reduce equity or deny access to certain people groups and the privileging of some groups over others. I've also heard it defined as a mental attitude formed over an extended period of time, reflected in social institutions. So I'm going to ask the three of you to define systemic racism on your context and from your unique perspective. So we will start with Greg.
Well, you've given a very comprehensive definition of systemic racism. One of the things I sort of like to think about when it comes to systemic racism is the fact that Canada's economic and social structures are built on or founded in European principles. So when you look at European social and economic structures like the feudal system, where you had kings and lords and knights, and then you had at the bottom the peasants and the serfs, and then you go forward to other structures such as mercantilism and industrialism and imperialism, colonialism, and then of course now capitalism. For those structures to work, there needs to be an underclass that is exploited for their labor in order for the middle class and the upper class to thrive. And throughout history, we see that, and particularly in North America, Blacks have often been that underclass. We were brought in and exploited as free laborers, and in order for the middle class and the upper class to continue living the lifestyle that the privileged lifestyle that they have, we have to be exploited. And then you see that that working in systems such as education, where you'll often see black students funneled into certain areas of learning so that they can only have certain careers. You'll also see that in the workforce again, where we have the proverbial glass ceiling, where you can only go so far. Because again, in order to allow the middle class and the upper class to sustain their lifestyle, there has to be a group that is exploited. So systemic racism, where blacks are concerned, it's this sort of keeping black people in certain positions of servitude or frontline service in order to be exploited as a cheap source of labor, so that the upper class and middle class can thrive.
Okay, so have you seen any improvement in this over the years?
In education, there are definitely strides that are being made. We are definitely engaging in more professional development to try to curb this activity of streaming. In the 80s and the 90s, many black students were being streamed and being put into what, well, back then it was called general. So you had general and advanced streams, and now it's called applied and academic, but back then it was general, and you saw a lot of students being forced into general classes. I myself was put into general for grade 9, and if it wasn't for my siblings coming in and sort of to my rescue, my older siblings, and forcing the guidance counselors to then put me into the advanced stream, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to go on to do the things that I'm doing now. And that's not to say that being in general or in applied is a bad thing. It's just you should have the choice of choosing where you'd like to go. And a lot of black students were streamed at that time. So you're seeing a lot of professional development for guidance counselors and educators across the board to sort of eradicate that behavior.
Okay, thank you. So we will move on to Campbell, if you can just share from your perspective as an Indigenous person.
Thanks, Christelle. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak for the Indigenous peoples of Canada, recognizing that I'm one amongst very many Indigenous peoples. I want to also recognize Greg's, what he has said and agree with, and just maybe add to that a little bit, that all of a systemic racist society or organization is done so by design. Canada, at its foundations, was designed to be systemically racist because it was trying to acquire land that belonged to someone else. And to do that, you had to demean and cause those people to be seen as less in the eyes of someone else. And so that is what was done, and I maybe answer that a little bit more in a follow-up question, but right from then forward, and even till today, Indigenous people are still being marginalized in that way, racialized in that way. And there is a reason and a design behind it. And I think we really need to recognize that this is designed. I would maybe just add to that, any time a good design happens, I know Apple is famous for this, it becomes so intuitive, it's just second nature. That systemic racism has been designed so well here in Canada that many of us don't even realize it's happening, even though it's happening well.
Another descriptor for systemic racism is hidden racism. I've heard that Canada has a lot of hidden racism as opposed to the United States, where it's more in your face. So I would like to hear from you, Paul, on that as far as the criminal justice system.
Well, thank you, Crystal, for allowing me to be here. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to piggyback and echo on the comments made by both Greg and Campbell. Likewise, and what I think one of the themes I've heard from what they both have been saying is that systemic racism is really something that's been designed to exploit a certain class of people, and it can be obviously applied on the basis of racism or racial skin color or category or culture, and that kind of is reflected in this idea of exploitation. It has been unfortunately somewhat reflected in the criminal justice system, whether it's overtly or explicitly, or even worse, I would say sometimes, in my opinion, subjectively or unconsciously or subconsciously. It's an idea of essentially using one avenue or one institution of society to control a group of people, and further marginalize them and further discriminate against them. There has been an overrepresentation, and that's the most evident way of that is being an overrepresentation of black accused in institutions, in jail institutions, but not only black accused, but Indigenous accused as well too. It's also evident in the types of criminal offenses that certain races are charged with, as opposed to other races. It's also evident in terms of an overrepresentation of accused in the courthouse per se. When you walk into a courthouse or a courtroom, you tend to see a lot more people of a certain racial group than other people. And so it evidences itself that way. It's also an attitude in terms of how the police arrest and deal with certain people. So for instance, one person might be arrested, or two people might be arrested for the same offense, but if they're of different races, how the police end up dealing with them could be different. Whereas a white person might be let go with a warning, or a person of a racialized category or group might actually have to be arrested and taken into court and given a criminal charge and have to actually go through the court system. So it's a separation to make people unequal and to take from, basically apply certain things to other people to make them further marginalized. It's also an attitude, unfortunately, from how a prosecutor might prosecute a case. And again, I'm not saying all prosecutors are this way, but it's an unconscious, subconscious attitude. Unfortunately, sometimes it even permeates into defense lawyers, how defense lawyers look at their clients and how they may treat their clients and how they may advocate for their clients. It also rolls up to how judges look at different accused that appear before them. So it's all a matter of an attitude that's used as another way of social control and making one group feel disadvantaged compared to other groups.
Okay. So for me, a very important question in figuring out how we got here, where systemic racism is rampant, is understanding where we come from. So I'm going to turn to our historian here, Greg, to share with us from the perspective of Black Canadians.
So with Black Canadians, we're often viewed as this new group, new to Canada. And if you're new, then you don't have as much roots here, so you don't have as much rights. And that's because people just don't understand how long Black people have been here. You have the first recorded Black man, Matthew DaCosta, coming to Canada in the early 1600s. Then you have the first enslaved Black from Madagascar coming here in around 1628, Olivier Lejeune. So Black people have been here from the 1600s. The Black presence in Canada dates back that far. Then further on, you have, I believe in the 1700s, you have the Loyalists, and these were slaves who, or enslaved Blacks rather, who fought on the side of the British against the Americans in the Revolutionary War. And they were promised land and all kinds of opportunities if they fought for the British, because the British thought they were going to win and they lost. So then they said, you know what, we'll give you land in Nova Scotia. So you come with us to Nova Scotia and we'll set you up there. They bring them to Nova Scotia, and they were supposed to get a certain amount of land that they could farm and sustain themselves. And some were given land, but it was land that they could not cultivate. And then others were not given land at all. So they were basically living in abject poverty. Then you have the fugitive slaves, those who came up through the Underground Railroad coming in the 1800s. And they too, though Canada likes to view itself as this sort of oasis and haven for slaves or enslaved Blacks who were trying to escape bondage in the US, they came here, but they didn't necessarily have the welcome mat rolled out for them. right? So they were allowed to live here as free persons, but they were treated as second-class citizens. So they lived in segregation. They went to segregated schools. A lot of people don't know that Canada has a long history of segregation, all the way down to where we hear about Viola Desmond later on, being placed in a portion of the theater that was reserved for blacks, and she didn't want to, she was in a place that was reserved for white Canadians, and she didn't want to go to the place that was designated for black Canadians. So those who came here through the Underground Railroad, they suffered second-class citizenship. And then you move down now into the early 1900s, and you have black men being recruited from Barbados to work in the coal mines in Nova Scotia, because Nova Scotian men didn't want to do the work because it was dangerous. And there was also this belief that was going around that was being perpetuated, that blacks were better suited for heat, so they could work in these unbearably hot conditions and unsafe conditions in the coal mines in Nova Scotia. Around that same time, you had women being recruited from the island of Guadeloupe to come and work as nannies in Quebec to again meet labor shortages there. Then you fast forward to the 1950s, and you have the West Indian Domestic Labor Scheme, and this is where they go and they recruit women from Jamaica, Trinidad, and Barbados in particular at first, and then later on Grenada, St. Vincent, and other islands, to come in and work again as nannies. And the reason they're brought in is because this is after World War II, and Canadian women had an opportunity to go work in factories and join the workforce because their husbands and brothers and the Canadian men were off fighting the war. So after that, they don't want to stay in the house and work or be housewives anymore. So now they bring in these black women from the different islands, but they have all kinds of restrictions on these women, and for 3 or 4 years they're not allowed to educate themselves, they're not allowed to bring their family over, there's certain nights that they're not allowed to go out, all kinds of different restrictions that they have on these women. So you see that we're always brought in to fill labor shortages, and this idea that black people are supposed to be frontline workers and are only supposed to go so far, it's so entrenched in Canadian society that it is difficult, I believe, for Canadians or so-called Canadians to unlearn, because that's how they view black people, because this is historically what we were brought here to do, was basically to serve. So again, when we're talking about systemic racism, it's this idea of there's a whole history behind it. We're talking about 300 to 400 years of history behind it, and now about 50 to 100 years where we're trying to reverse that, and there's incremental success, but there's still a lot of work to do. So again, with the glass ceiling, and you were talking before about covert racism, it's really difficult to fight it because you don't know that it's happening to you, right? Mm-hmm. You send in your resume and your name happens to be Jamal Brown, and they see that name on the resume and you don't even get an interview, and you don't know why you're not getting a call back. Or your name is Greg Burkett and you sound a certain way on the phone, and then you show up and they realize, oh, you're not who we thought you were. And all of a sudden you're not getting the call back after they seem to be thrilled with you on the phone because you checked all the boxes, all the criteria that they had for the job. So covert racism in Canada has this huge history, this huge weight behind it, and it's very difficult to undo, and it's very difficult to fight.
Right. Well, I believe that awareness is the first step to being able to fight. So thank you for all that you've shared with us. Now I'd like Campbell to just share, we can't ignore that Indigenous peoples have faced a lot of discrimination throughout history. So if you can just share with us some of the major challenges.
Yeah, definitely. Being Métis, I have the honor of dealing with both the good and bad of two societies essentially coming together. And so I'd like to start with my white ancestors back roughly the 1500s, wanting to, their context was a population that was growing and outgrowing its land base. Nations that needed resources to build some further strength and success and wealth. And so they started looking out to this age of discovery, this age of exploration. And through that process, many of these nations of Europe came over to North America. They came with at least 3 papal bulls connected with the idea of the doctrine of discovery, which meant and said that if there were non-Christians in this land that you're going to, then they don't really own the land. You can do whatever you need to claim that land for the nation that you're representing. Now I'd like to step over into my Indigenous roots. Indigenous people almost right throughout North America have a saying in the different languages, comes out to the idea of all my relations, that all of us are connected, all of us have benefits when we work together, all of us have responsibilities when we work together, but that everything I do has an effect on you as another person and on the environment, on all portions of society and how we live. So when these new people show up, I want to emphasize who the new people are. When these new people show up, they want to, the Indigenous people are like, hey, they're not going to survive. They don't know this land, we're going to help. And so in that process, the many hundreds of sovereign nations, Indigenous nations of this land, made agreements and treaties with those people and nations that were coming over. Shared responsibilities, share the land, and share the benefits. Through those treaties, which are still today recognized as binding international law, there were agreements between these nations to set up what would become Canada. The Indigenous nations of this country have never broken one of those treaties. But the nations coming over, as I said before, needed land, needed resources, and this is well documented, it's historical fact. And so to get that land and those resources, they had to break the treaties. Some people look at and know that there may be reserves next to them. Reserves are Indigenous segregation. White settlers predominantly don't want Indigenous people living near them. And so one of the things that became Canadian law was enacted in the Indian Act was reserve system. You as a group of people are going to go over here and live in this area, and you will be able to do things within that area, but we're going to provide an Indian agent. And any interaction that you want with the outside world has to go through that Indian agent. This is the start of things in legalized changes and legalized either assimilation or annihilation. We had 10 to 15, conservatively 10 to 15 million people here in Canada, and Indigenous people now at first contact, and now we are down to just over 1 million. If the statements that were made by Sir John A. Macdonald, Prime Minister Borden, others throughout the years, is essentially the only good Indian is a dead Indian. If we're going to get the Indian, the savage, again terms used to minimize and marginalize people, if we're going to get that out of the Indian population, then we need to take their kids away from them. That became residential schools, which took place for almost 80 years. The last one closed in the mid-90s. There are people walking around my age and younger who are survivors of residential schools. Those residential schools predominantly were very abusive. They took away everything that made, every value that a person had. Right? You come in as early as 4 years old sometimes. You come in and everything, your family, your faith, everything that made you you was stripped from you. And that was done for up to 10, 15 years for some of these children. And so they come out of there obviously damaged. They don't know how to be a healthy person in society. They pass that on to their kids. They pass that on to their kids. The lateral violence that, the violence that was learned in those residential schools, so many people will come to me and say, well, how come, but look at the Indigenous population, what happens on their reserves today? There's abuse there. And taken away from the normal human propensity to abuse others, there is very good reasons for this, and that is because when you learn to deal with other people through violence, and you don't have anything else to replace that with, it's going to move laterally through your community. And when that happens, you then learn to be violent in doing, how you raise your kids, how you interact with someone you disagree with. And so the damages of that have come out, so many health concerns today, right from everything as far as health is pretty much running at epidemic levels in many Indigenous communities. And yet, and I want to end with this, is that we are still here. Right? And the Indigenous population is strong, it's resilient, and it still has the same desire today as it did with first contact. And that is, this can be an amazing country for all of us, but it has to be equal for all of us.
Yes, absolutely. So one of the things that we celebrate in Ontario Conference is the fact that we're one of the most diverse conferences in the North American division. So I just want to ask our panelists here, if someone were to ask you as a church, why should racial discrimination issues matter to me? Say that they aren't in a marginalized group, how would you respond? So we can start with Greg again.
How can you say that you are a Seventh-day Adventist Christian, part of the Protestant movement? The very word Protestant comes out of what? Protest, right? Adventism. They're linked. They're intricately linked. This idea that we're fighting for religious liberty and we're fighting for social justice. How can you call yourself a Seventh-day Adventist and ignore what's happening to people around the world? To me, that's really hypocritical. Maybe it's an oxymoron. When you look at the history of our church, and you understand that William Miller was an abolitionist, big-time abolitionist, to the point where he believed that slaveholders and slaveholding was Babylon, and to come out of Babylon meant you needed to get rid of your slaves. And then you have, of course, Ellen White, whose very stance on education for Black people was connected to reparations. She thought that the way to build Black communities after what had been done to them, or Black people after what had been done to them in slavery, was to bring education to them. And she was very much she was so much opposed to slavery that she said that those who were fighting on the South were actually they were influenced by the devil. It was demonic, right? So how can you say that you're a Seventh-day Adventist Christian, given that history, and still try to ignore social injustice? How can you allow things like music and culture to stand in your way of worshiping with other people? To me, is mind-boggling that that's something that could, you have to have a separate, you have to have separate worship services and camp meetings and all those kinds of things because of music and preaching style. right? Given what kind of heaven are you expecting to go to? That's all I have to say.
That's a very good point. Okay, so maybe we'll move to Campbell if you want to share.
Sure. Christ died not for Christian rights. He didn't die for Jewish rights. He died for the right of every human to be able to choose the life they wanted to live. And if we are to be like Jesus, he went to the point of dying for that. He believed in it so much. That is a picture of who God is. That we should not be standing anywhere because of the color of our skin and allowing systemic racism, racism in any form, to be continuing and still be claiming that we are Christian. We need to enter into a process, and as a white person, I would really suggest that we need to get past, well, first of all, understand what white privilege is. Don't be afraid to look at that and confront it and be able to look into your own heart and say, I want to be better, I want to be more like Christ. Because white privilege and what racism is and what systemic racism is need to be looked at and confronted in order to be more like Jesus.
Right. So here's a big question. So what are some ways to combat systemic racism? So this could be either on a personal level, institutional, or as a church. And I'll open the floor to anyone who wants to answer.
Everyone's pointing at me. Well, I certainly I can try my best to answer the question, or at least provide my views on it. And I'm going to obviously focus it on from my background, my criminal justice background. I want to be clear to point out that when I was asked earlier about systemic racism, how it's being evidenced in the criminal justice system, there has been in the last number of years, and it may even seem like recent number of years, starting probably in the early 90s, there's been a shift in the focus, particularly from the courts and from judges, to start to become alive to issues of systemic racism and realizing that they're real, they're prevalent, it's not something that's made up, it's not something imagined by the people who are experiencing it, which is often a way to dismiss these notions that people who have been marginalized would bring up, that it's something that needs to be dealt with. And the courts, when I say courts, I mean judges, have taken a role upon themselves to make it clear that this is, if we're going to start to confront this issue, then the courts have to take a role and take a leadership role. Cases from the early 90s, the most seminal case from the Supreme Court of Canada is a case called Regina versus Gladue, which is a case that dealt with Indigenous and the accused. And the Supreme Court of Canada, with the highest court in the country, flat out recognized and said, listen, we are recognizing that there is systemic racism that has been affecting Indigenous accused. They're overrepresented in the criminal justice system. They're overrepresented as being incarcerated, and so we as a court have to take a better approach. And that case essentially gave an outline for other courts to follow in terms of how they should deal with Indigenous accused, and really make an effort to reduce them in the prison population. Other cases is another case called Regina versus Brown, and that case is with the accused named Dee Brown. And for anyone who's an older basketball fan, Dee Brown played for the Toronto Raptors. He started off his career with the Celtics, if I'm not mistaken. That's where he really got famous. And he got traded to the Raptors, and he was playing with the Raptors. And Mr. Dee Brown one evening was driving his car, and obviously it's a nice car, along the DVP in Toronto, and ultimately was pulled over by the police and couldn't figure out why. Long story short, he ended up getting charged with a number of offenses. And at his case, his lawyer decided to argue that the only reason why Mr. Brown was pulled over was because he was a black man. And in the early 90s, that was a huge argument for the lawyer to make. I've actually spoken to the lawyer who represented Mr. Brown. He's given a number of different talks over the years, and he's saying the amount of pushback and blowback and ridicule he received from the prosecutor, from the judge who was hearing the case, was unbelievable. But that case ultimately went all the way up to the Court of Appeal in Ontario, and the Court of Appeal agreed that the only reason why Mr. Brown was pulled over was because he was racially profiled, and that started off the discussion. Other cases, there's a case called Regina versus Parks, which deals with the idea that deals with discrimination in the context of a jury panel. And the lawyers in the Parks case essentially pushed the court to allow them to ask more probing questions of prospective jurors on the basis of potential racial bias. And that was never allowed before. And again, in order to be able to advance that argument, the lawyers had to bring in psychological data, psychological studies that show that people have unconscious biases. They had to bring in all kinds of empirical data to be able to convince the court that this is something that's real, and we should be allowed to ask these questions of prospective jurors other than just asking them regular mundane questions that don't get to the heart of the matter. So the Parks decision was very important. That's again in the mid to late 90s, if I'm not mistaken. Lastly, there's a recent case from last year from the Supreme Court of Canada called Regina versus Lee, LE, that talks again about arbitrary detention and how now the courts have to actually consider that when you're deciding whether or not a person's been detained by the police and whether or not there's any actual basis for that detention by the police, if the person is from a racialized minority group, the court actually has to consider whether or not their race has anything to do with the fact that whether or not they've been detained. And the court has to be alive to those issues and not to ignore them. And the court makes comments that we've over the years have moved from the point of these are actual hard statistical facts that racism exists, and the court needs to be alive to them. And you no longer actually have to bring forward evidence per se, like traditional evidence. A judge can actually take what's called judicial notice, which means a judge actually just accepts this is an actual hard cold fact that racism exists. I don't need any proof of that. I don't need someone giving me a study to show me that racism exists. I believe it and I know it, so I'm going to use that as a factor when I'm deciding whether or not this person was mistreated by the police. So that's a real shift from an institutional perspective to really deal with these issues of systemic racism and making sure that we as a society deal with them. I would say, just in closing, the recent protests is only going to help to move the conversation even forward, even more, so that systemic racism in the criminal justice system is really dealt with seriously. When there's an encounter between a person, a member of the public, with the police, there isn't a judge there, there isn't a lawyer there who can stand over their shoulder and say, officer, you can't do that, or Mr. Member of the public, this is what you should do, this is what you shouldn't do. So there's a big responsibility on the police actually to interpret the law correctly and apply the law correctly, because we as lawyers and judges get to play armchair quarterbacks later on, but that's weeks, months, years down the road. So the courts, the judges have come to recognize that they have to do a better job of providing direction to police officers, so that they can not rely on stereotypes and rely on unconscious views, subconscious views when they're dealing with members of the public.
Right. So I'm just wondering, you had mentioned earlier that protest can make a difference. So what are maybe one of the key ways in which you think protesting would make a difference?
From a personal standpoint, I think the protesting makes a difference because it pushes these issues in the forefront. We can no longer just sweep them under the rug. We can no longer pretend that they don't exist. it's right in your face. So I hope that the protests and the recent protests we've had, that we don't lose the momentum, that we push forward the issues, that we make it forefront of the issues, so that people are going to want to have a change and want the institutions of society to be better. Again, from my perspective, being a participant in the criminal justice system, the change is going to have to come from within. But people can use these protests as a springboard to put pressure on people who make the decisions. In Canada, we don't have a system like they do in the States, where you can vote for members of the criminal justice system. You can vote for a judge. You vote for the district attorney. That's not how it works here in Canada. I mean, judges are appointed, and the process, in some aspects, is somewhat secretive. The average member of the public doesn't know how a judge is appointed. But if the average member of the public says, "Well, I want the bench or the judiciary to look a certain way, to be more reflective of how society actually looks," then they can put pressure on the politicians, who, in some aspects, have some decisions as to who judges are, right? And put pressure on the politicians to make it more diverse, to make it look more diverse, to make it look more equal and more fair. And diversity doesn't necessarily mean you have to have more judges of a certain race or a certain ethnic background who are sitting in courts, because diversity can come from a number of different perspectives and a number of different life experiences. And you don't know what a person's life experience may be. And you look at Campbell and you might think, well, he has a certain life experience based on the way he looks. But when you actually get to know him, you realize his life experience is a lot more diverse. And hey, you know what? That person actually might be a good judge, because of that life experience they have. And I know the protests put pressure on people to want to change from within. Maybe these protests put an idea in some young person's head that, you know what, I'm going to go to law school, right? I want to be part of the solution, and I want to become a lawyer so I can help advocate and fight for people who don't feel like their rights are being respected. Because to be honest, to be frank, there aren't a lot of racialized minorities in law school, right? There aren't a lot of racialized minorities in certain professions to begin with. To get back to the whole idea of systemic racism and systemic institutions and only reserving certain jobs for certain people. Again, law schools are doing better. When I went to law school, my first year class had the highest percentage of black students at Osgoode Hall to date at that time, and you see it in other law schools and medical schools. It's becoming better, but I mean, hopefully these protests are a way to open up the avenues and open up the issues and have people talk about it and say, all right, if I'm going to make a change, what can I do? Maybe it's pursuing a certain profession, maybe it's pursuing a certain trade, or going down a certain avenue of education.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for sharing that. So we will have Campbell, you can just give us some pointers from your perspective.
I think a big part of it is understanding what it means to be an ally. If you're not a part of one of those racialized groups. And I would say, as a white person, you don't necessarily get to define what an ally means. Mm-hmm. The community that you look at and say, hey, maybe this is somewhere I can, take my privilege and help out in some way, is you need to talk with people of that community. You need to educate yourself. Justice Murray Sinclair, who headed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Indigenous people, he said, education got us into this mess. Education will get us out. We need to educate ourselves. One of the main problems with systemic racism is that it's built and designed into the system not to tell that other side or other sides of the story. So go out and learn those other sides. become an ally. And I would say for a lot of white people, well, all people in general have prejudices and discrimination tendencies, right? When it comes to racism, you can be a good person and be racist because it's been built into and trained into us. It's confronting that and saying, you know, as a Christian, or even if you're not a Christian, this is wrong and it's not the way I want to be. I want to be better. So I'm going to go learn. I'm going to educate myself. I'm going to ask other people to educate me. And hopefully through that, we become allies.
Okay. So that's a very good point about being an ally. And my final question will be, just when you see for anyone who wants to answer first, when you see the changes that are happening right now, you know, people are waking up to the fact that there is racism in Canada. How does that make you feel? And I'll add, if you can just give like a word of wisdom from the Bible to encourage everybody who's watching this to get engaged in fighting racial discrimination.
As a person in their 50s, and I won't go any more than that, I would just say there's something different today. And for me, I'm saying finally, more people are getting this. And with that, I would also say we can't let the momentum be missed. We need to organize. I don't know what that looks like, but people need to organize whatever race they find themselves in a way that is going to build a better and stronger, more equal country. And going back to my own faith, I would say, for God so loved the world. It doesn't say there, this part of the world, that part of the world, this person of this race. He loves everybody, and he asks me to do the same. So I need to do that, and sometimes that means standing up where people's voice and their agency have been taken away. I need to be there in that gap, helping them to get that back so they can have their voice and agency back.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. So Paul next.
Sure. I find the recent protests very, very encouraging. It's unfortunate it took the death of a black man to do that, and you know, just take a step back. When I first saw the video of Mr. Floyd being killed, I actually first didn't watch it in its entirety because one of my friends sent it to me, and I actually honestly thought it was like an archive video from an event that had happened earlier. So my brain was already trained to think, oh, you know, here's another black man being killed by the police. Nothing new, right? Unfortunately, nothing new. Then I started to watch it more, and I realized that this is a brand new video, and this happened, and it's someone even more different because Mr. Floyd was literally, you know, begging and pleading for his life. You know, there was no scuffle, there was no running away kind of thing from the police, and he's getting shot, and he's literally being killed, and someone's recording it, and it was obviously disturbing. It was very upsetting. It was eye-opening, but then to see the response, obviously you knew there's going to be protests in the States, so there was no doubt that was going to happen. But to see that spark, that fire catch, and that flame catch, and it literally go all the way around the world, and, people in other countries, people, where the majority of those countries are white Europeans who would never necessarily experience what George Floyd is going through, went through, or in the streets marching and calling for justice. I mean, that's unheard of. You've never seen it before, so it's very encouraging. And as Cam was saying, I hope the momentum doesn't end. To bring it back to a biblical perspective, I don't think I have necessarily one salient text, but just looking at the example of Jesus Christ, how he lived his life, he wasn't afraid to speak up for the marginalized.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't afraid to speak up for the disadvantaged. He wasn't afraid to speak up for the quote-unquote lower class, who were his friends. You know, the 12 people he hung out with the most, by our standards today, would have been general laborers.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so by our, upper middle class standards, even myself, to be frank, I may not be hanging out with these people who in that social and economic status. This is Jesus Christ, the King of the world, the Son of God, and he's hanging out with fishermen. He's taking the time to minister to Mary Magdalene, who was caught in the actual act of adultery and about to be stoned, and being her friend. So if the Son of God can act that way, like how dare I not, kind of thing. How dare I not,
Mm-hmm. And Greg, take us away.
Wow. So I guess, seeing what's happening does give you some hope. I do like the fact that it's, it's sort of, there's a youthful energy to the protests. It's a lot of young people that are leading out and throughout history, you often see, people don't even realize because he was so mature, but Martin Luther King was really young when he was leading the movement. Malcolm X was really young. These guys were all really young people that were galvanizing their peers and pushing the movement forward. And it's good to see that young people are taking up that mantle now. My fear is sort of what Campbell was saying. I hope that it doesn't. It's not a fad. I hope that it's not something that 5 or 6 years from now they'll say, yeah, remember when we were marching and that thing that happened, yeah. And it's not something that's still relevant to them 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now. One of the other things that I worry about is the backlash, because I think the backlash is inevitable. After slavery, there was Reconstruction, and they had given a lot of positions of political power anyways to black men and women, black men in particular in the United States. And then you saw a huge backlash later on, and then you had the burning of the Wall Street in Tulsa and just terrorism, and then Jim Crow and all these things that were enacted afterwards as backlash. You think about who was leading the United States prior to the leadership now, and you can argue that the leadership now is backlash based on who was leading prior to who's in power now. So I feel like backlash is inevitable. What are we going to do? What is our plan to fight against what's going to come? So those are some of the things that I think about, and that the pessimist sort of comes out and fights a little bit with the optimist. But I would still say I'm a bit more optimistic this time around than after some of the other incidents, after Mike Brown or after Trayvon. I didn't see the world coming out and supporting the way I'm seeing it now. So I'm a little more optimistic now, but I'm still, I still have some reservations, and not necessarily reservations. I'm just hoping that it's not something that is going to just sort of see itself peter out in the future. Biblically, if I'm thinking of John 13:35, where it says something to the effect of, "Men will know that you're my disciples by your love," right? By this men will know that you're Christ's disciples, by the love that you show. So to me, it's, if you are saying that you are a Christian and you're supposed to be emulating Christ's lifestyle, then you should be loving everyone, and that love is more than lip service; it's action, right? So, as was said before, the idea of being an ally, what does that really mean? I think a lot of that has to do with listening. Asking questions and listening to what people are saying. How can I help? not this is what I'm going to do to help. Ask how I can help, how I can join. What do you have in place already that I can be a part of and that I can support? And if I have all this privilege, which you do have, how can I use that privilege to further your cause? Right? So oftentimes when we talk about allies often feel that they need to come in and do for you. Don't come in and do for me. Ask me how you can help me. Because I know how to do. Right? Just ask me how you can assist, and we can work together for sure.
Okay. So I like that last part of what you said, that we can work together. And I hope that this discussion is just the starting point of showing how we can work together as allies to fight racism, as Christians, as Christ's method was that he mingled with the people as one who desired their good. He met their practical needs, and then he bade them follow me. So this is definitely a practical need, which is fighting for equality of all people, because Christ died for all of us. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
And I wish you all the best with your continued work in this fight.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes.